Good morning, everybody. I'm Executive Director Julie Perlin, and I'm coming to you streaming live for this great event this morning for our members, directly from the Soot and Water Gallery here at the Catalina Island Museum. I thought I would switch up my background and come to you live right from the gallery. And I was joking with the staff, I might move my office up here permanently. We'll see. Anyway, good morning again and welcome. We have a great program for you today with lots going on. We have with us, introduced to you in just a moment, Michael VanHartingsveldt. He is a curator that I came across when he was giving a lecture at Coastline Community College where my husband works. And he was talking about his the art form Gyotaku, along with artist Dwight Hwang, whose work you see in the background here. And I learned through that lecture that Dwight sources his fish from Catalina. And I thought to myself, well, this is someone that I need to get in touch with and learn more about. At that time, Michael was at LACMA as an East Asian specialist, working with the collections there, and also a freelance curator, working with the Japan Foundation. Now he's at the University of Kansas, where he's working on his PhD, trying to learn Japanese and teaching a couple courses. So he's a super busy guy, and we're really glad to have him here. Please welcome, in just a moment, Michael VanHartingsveldt, the guest curator for this exhibition. And I just want to take a quick second and let everyone know we are working so hard here at the museum on our forthcoming Titanic exhibition, which will be a virtual premiere and our benefit. So if you have not signed up, please take a moment to join this free event in celebration of this massive Titanic accomplishment for the museum by going to betterunite.com/Catalina Museum. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. And Michael, we're anxious to hear from you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Very, very happy to be joining you. Very excited to be here with everybody, and I'm very excited to be sharing the art form Gyotaku. So I hope everybody can see the slideshow that I just brought up onto the page. All right, so the title of the show is Soot and Water, Gyotaku Records of Catalina, and I'm going to be touching on each of those words in the title just to further explain them as we progress through this presentation. Soot is an ingredient used in sumi ink. Water is a way to control the viscosity of sumi ink. And Gyotaku and Records of Catalina, those are some things that we will touch in the final slide. The artist of all the pieces that are exhibited in this exhibition is Dwight Hwang. He is Los Angeles based. He works out of a studio in his house. He sources his fish from local fishmongers and fish markets. Or he catches them himself. And I am the curator, as Julie so wonderfully said. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. So Gyotaku, I think, is the most important thing to touch on right now. So what is Gyotaku? It's a word that is easily mispronounced. So I have a pronunciation guide there, Gyotaku. Gyotaku is the proper way to say it if you've got the Japanese intonation. And Gyotaku, it literally means fish rubbing. And you're going to see a little bit later on when we do the live when we show that demonstration, the video of the demonstration, that it is literally taking ink, putting it on a fish, and taking a rubbing off of it. It's a really beautiful art form. There is a legacy of ink rubbing in East Asia. What you can see to the far right of the screen is something that dates back to about the 7th or 8th century in China. And what would happen is they would take large sheets of paper and they would lay them over these monumental stone stelae. Stelae are basically monuments that have been engraved with stories, with writings, with religious or historical context. And they would lay this paper on top of the inscriptions. They would use a wet sort of brush, coarse brush, and they would tamp it so that the paper would go down into the indentations of the letters. And then they would blot ink on top of the surface to get the impression that you see here. Now, this is something that continued on into fish in the mid-19th century in Japan. So while the legacy of ink rubbing does have its origins in China, Japan is the point of origin for Gyotaku specifically. And it happened fairly recently, about 150 years ago in the mid-19th century. And there are two stories about how it originated. One is with a samurai lord who wanted a lot of his catches, a lot of his auspicious catches, a lot of his impressive catches to be documented. And there was probably a somewhat grumpy calligrapher who, instead of painting the fish each time, just thought the idea of maybe spreading ink over the surface and dabbing the paper on top of it, and then making an inscription as to the details of that catch. So that's sort of the high-born idea, that it's linked to samurai. The merchant origin is that there were a lot of people who only understood basic information. They couldn't read these large documents. And so rather than including parchments with words written on them, instead merchants would use pictures of fish as documents to advertise the fish that they were selling. Now, these both have an origin in something that is rather documentative, something that it serves a more practical purpose. What Dwight Hwang is doing is he's making it into a fine art. He's breathing new life into specimens. And this is something that already was started in the 1960s in the United States by a group called the Nature Printing Society. They wanted to take Gyotaku and elevate it into a fine art form. What I would like to do is explain why Dwight Hwang considers himself a traditionalist of Gyotaku. You will see a lot of modern Gyotaku that have been completed with acrylic paints on different surfaces like ceramics or on fabrics or on cottons, linens. You will see Gyotaku being produced in a lot of different ways. But Dwight Hwang, he prides himself on being a traditionalist. And the reason that we can call him a traditionalist is that he largely limits himself to 4 different materials or tools. And these are what you see on the screen right now: the brush, the ink, the stone, and for Dwight specifically, paper. These 4 elements are called the 4 friends of the study in Japan, or bunbo shiho. And here you can see you've got the brush right there. You've got different sizes of brush, different textures of brush. You have the ink, which is this stick right there, and I'm going to go a little bit more into that. You've got the grindstone, which is a beautiful piece that is used in the study. And then you also have the paper. And the paper is exceptionally important for Dwight's process, obviously. So the ink and the stone. The ink is what I'll start with. It is called sumi. So when you have somebody say sumi ink, it is a Japanese development. It is something called lamp black soot. It is made out of lamp black soot. And what that means is that they would take aromatic woods and they would burn them. And as these materials burned, there would be this soot, the smoke that rises from the fire. And they would put a hood above the fire, and the soot would collect on the bottom of this hood. And then what would happen is artisans, they would come and they would scrape off the soot into a container, and they would mix it with a binding agent. And that would make it something that could be molded, something that could be formed. And they would make these very ornamental, very beautiful ink sticks that are then ground to form the ink. Now, why did they go through such a difficult process to produce the sumi? That's because soot-based ink, if you're doing the lamp black soot, that process that I described, it makes it a very fine ink with hardly any sort of noticeable texture or grinds or anything. It's a very, very fine way to produce ink that doesn't leave remnants of itself behind on the paper or on the surface that you're using. You don't want stones, or you don't want little chunks of ink. You want something that is very smooth and has a very silky finish. The suzuri, which is the grindstone, it allows you to have control over ink viscosity. And what a lot of calligraphers and ink painters and Dwight himself do is they will grind the ink stick that you see that he's holding in his hand here. He will grind that down, and he will control just how much he produces to get the texture that he wants. If he wants a darker, more vivid, more contrasting black spot, he will make it very, very thick. If he wants almost like a wash, something that creates a very, very faded, almost whimsical atmospheric feel, he will make something that fades out. He washes the ink onto the paper, and that will be just a little bit of ink mixed in with a lot of water. And there are even ways to control the tonality of an ink just by the amount of water that you mix with the ink that you grind out. You can get brown tones, you can get blue tones, you can get green tones. It's really interesting. Because Hwang is such a high in demand artist now, he gets a lot of commissions every day. He limits the controlling the viscosity, grinding his own ink. He limits that to small to medium-sized fish. He usually follows a traditional process for that. Unfortunately, for the really large fish that you see, for example, the mahi-mahi or even the barracuda, because he's doing such large numbers of them, as we see there over Julie's right shoulder, because he's producing those in such large amounts, it would take a lot of extra hours to grind that ink. So he's going to use bottled ink that has been produced in the traditional technique, but he'll buy it bottled. If he's feeling particularly in need of control, he will actually mix some of his hand ground ink into the store-bought ink to sort of control the thickness there as well. And here we can just see the process of grinding, creating the ink, and then he will pour it into a container that he will use. So just think about the sound that fills the study as you're grinding the stone. This is a process, it's meditative. You think about the art that is about to be created. The Japanese paper is an exceptionally important part of Gyotaku as well, because you are working with wet ingredients. Something that we've probably all found out when working with American papers is that if you make them wet, they are mostly going to just fall apart. They're very easily, once they get wet, they'll just fall apart. And that's because they're made largely from a pulp process. You pulp the paper and you mash it down and you flatten and you make these papers. Washi is produced much differently. It's handmade and it's made from specially cultivated plants, usually mulberry trees. And Dwight, he looks for mulberry tree paper for the most part. He will explore other plants as well in the paper that he works with, but the most reliable he has found is the ones from the mulberry tree. The reason that he really likes it is because Japanese paper uses very, very long strands. And you can see that in the picture that I have here on the right. You can see these long strands that go all the way down and they go all the way across. Think about the weft and the weave of like textiles. It's almost like a plant-based textile that's being produced here. And the reason that is so desirable for Gyotaku especially is because you are making the surface of the fish wet and you don't want the paper to fall apart. You want it to be strong, you want it to be durable, and you want it to retain its shape. Dwight usually works with Japanese papers, but he also explores Korean papers as well. And the quality of these papers is, both of them are just absolutely desirable for what he's creating. Now, the brush is a very, very cool tool as well. At first you think, oh, a brush is a very, very simple thing. It's really not. You take a handle and you are putting 3 different layers into there. You've got a core, and the core is very long. It sticks out the furthest. It's what constitutes the tip of the brush. So it goes all the way from the handle all the way up to the tip of the brush. The mantle are these really short hairs that go around the base of the core. And then the outer layers, they go around the mantle and they come up to meet the core that is reaching all the way up. And what that does is it creates a reservoir where ink can be collected inside those layers. And that allows for, if you're painting, you can wipe it across the paper and you'll have a reservoir of ink to draw from, rather than having to dip it every so often. And the reason this is useful for Dwight is because he can get a fish inked completely with one brush sometimes. A medium-sized fish, I've seen him take just a brush of ink, and I've seen him brush it over, and he gets all the ink he needs for a single print from one brush filled up. The reservoir is filled up with the ink, and he is able to get a single print with one brush load. It's really impressive. The other thing that Dwight uses the brushes for is to apply the ink and to the fish, and then to add in the eyes as well. Traditional Gyotaku, it actually calls for that a brush never touches the paper afterward. And that has since kind of changed over the definition of Gyotaku to allow for the painting of the eyes in afterward in order to create a lifelike sparkle in the eye. And Dwight, he often tries to only get the textures and everything. He wants to get that from the fish off the first print. He doesn't want to have to touch it up with the brush at all. The only thing he wants to do to add life back to the fish that he printed is to paint in the eye. And we can see, even from a distance on this oppa, you can see that there is the eye is just absolutely vivid. It almost seems to catch the eye. And as we come in close to it, you can see that the eye just is this very vividly painted. Dwight has an exceptional understanding of how light behaves in an eye. And so even on that close-up, we can see that it's painted in, but he's allowed areas of dry ink, like the ink, to kind of just be scraped across the paper, and in other places it's been thickly applied. So Dwight's technique, he uses something called the direct method, and this is the earliest practice. Remember when I mentioned earlier that there was a probably somewhat grumpy calligrapher who put ink just on a fish and put the paper on top, and boom, he's got a printed fish? That's sort of the process that Dwight uses as well, just a lot more finessed. If you look at the earliest prints from about 1935 to 1939, or 1835 to 1839, you will see that they're quite blotchy, that there wasn't a lot of control over the ink. And what Dwight has done is he's really finessed the process. He limits himself to monochromatic prints, usually. If he does want to do color, that's a very, very rare occasion for him. He usually likes to work in monochromatic. He thinks that the variance in the shades and the tints and the contrast that he can provide with ink is sufficient for the art form that he is trying to create. He has added some modern developments to what he's created. For example, the twist that you see here in the mahi mahi. Normally, traditionally, what you would see in a Gyotaku is it's just a print of a fish flat on its side. But because Dwight is so focused on adding life and reanimating the fish, the specimens that he prints, he looks at ways to add depth and add perspective to it. So the twist is one way he does that. Because when a fish jumps out of the water, it's not just this flat thing. It doesn't just have a single plane. It exists on multiple levels as it's jumping out. It's twisting its body. It's not going to land flat on its chin. It's not going to land flat on its belly. It's twisting in the air, and it's going to land differently than it jumped out of the water. And so Dwight wants to recreate that. He wants to show the twist in the body. Also with the perspective. A fish, when it moves through the water, it's moving its tail back and forth. It is not just kind of gliding through the water just as a flat thing. It is moving. It is directing its tail. It is, yeah, it's such a living thing. And the way that Dwight can recreate this life in the fish that he prints is by adding the perspective that we see on this yellowfin. The tail is twisted. This is exceptionally difficult to accomplish. It was largely thought impossible, but Dwight was able to practice what he was doing. And in manipulating the paper that he worked with, he was able to get almost foreshortening in the fish. And it's incredible that he was able to accomplish this. One other, I think, really cool modern development, and I would say that this is one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition, is the idea of reconstruction. So when you look at a lobster from the top, it seems fairly, it's complicated, but it seems fairly simple because there's a lot of just like flat areas that you could print off of it. But when you take that lobster and you turn it upside down, all of a sudden there becomes these myriad segments and myriad sections and little divots and little craters, and it becomes this really complicated thing to print. And Dwight, being he loves a challenge, he decided that one time he would try to print a spiny lobster from the bottom. And he tried to do it all intact, and it just didn't work because there were too many protruding levels to keep him from making a good quality print. So what he's done instead is he's decided to take the entire lobster apart, and then he reconstructs it on the paper. So he will take one section of the leg and he will print that. Then he will print the next leg, and he has to control the placement on the paper as well. And what we see here on the right of the screen is a reconstructed spiny lobster that impressively looks like it was never taken apart at all. Absolutely great development. So that brings us to Catalina. And what we were hoping to accomplish with Soot and Water, Gyotaku Records of Catalina, is that we wanted guests to feel like that they're stepping into an aquarium of fine art prints. And as you can see behind Julie there, it looks like you're stepping into a space where these fish are all swimming around you, almost as if they've been reanimated on the paper. These are dynamic portraits of Catalina pescafauna, and we really wanted to emphasize that the diverse marine life around Catalina. Because Catalina sort of is situated in the confluence of some major currents, you see some of the most diverse marine life in the entire world. It's just incredible what grows there. The kelp forests. Dwight had never worked with kelp before, but he thought, because we are doing something at Catalina, I really want to emphasize working with the kelp and making the fish interact around the kelp to recreate the kelp forests that surround Catalina. And that is something that he really, really wanted to emphasize and was really excited about doing. And I thought of this really cool historical connection. There used to be, built in 1950, there was something called the Catalina Diving Bell. And the whole idea of the Catalina Diving Bell was that tourists or visitors would go into it, and it would be lowered down down to the base of the kelp forest. And visitors would be able to see the fish interacting with the kelp. And that is something that we wanted to recreate with the gallery that Julie is in right now. And that is all the information I can give you for now. I would like to very warmly move into a demonstration video where I have interviewed Dwight, and we've overlaid our interview on the process as he prints. So hello everybody, my name is Michael VanHartingsveldt. I am the curator of Soot and Water, Gyotaku Records of Catalina, and I am having a fantastic interview with Dwight Hwang, who is the artist featured in the show. Dwight, how are you doing?
Good. Hi, Michael.
So here you are, you're putting the fish onto the table. It's an attractive looking fish. It looks pretty clean.
Yeah, it's a local cod, red rock cod, a red rock fish. And what I'm doing right now is basically wiping off, absorbing off all the excess moisture, the water, slime. Actually, a lot of the slime has already been pre-removed before we started shooting this video. But
so there's usually a lot more slime.
Yeah, there's usually a lot more slime, and some fish just have an extremely amount of slime. For example, like carp or catfish, but this one's not so much. But the idea is I need to remove most of, if not all of, the slime and the moisture, the excess moisture. Otherwise, when you apply ink and then press paper on it, you'll get globs transferred onto the paper instead of fine details.
And that's, like you were saying, that affects the paper, because then the paper gets too wet to handle, or you get too much thickness of the ink onto the paper.
Right. When you apply ink directly onto fish slime or just a lot of moisture, what you'll end up getting on the paper is just globs of black ink, really thick black ink, because that's what it's mixing with the ink and the slime itself.
Now I see that you're putting balled up paper towels into what look like cheek cavities.
Well, it's not a cheek cavity, but what that is it's either the wound from a hook, a fishing hook, or a gaff. There's a hole there. And so since it's an open wound, I have to fill it up with something, a wadded paper towel or whatever, in order to have it absorb enough moisture so that it doesn't transfer to the paper.
Okay. And then the same thing, what's happening with the nostrils?
Yes. Out of all the open orifices on a fish, the most problematic one is actually the tiniest one, and it's the nostril.
Huh. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So it looks like you would have to have a pretty intimate knowledge of different fish anatomies because of your Gyotaku projects.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of fish tend to be fairly similar, the way their bodies are structured, where things are located. But the more you know, the more intimate you are with fish or a specific kind of fish, then it tends to allow you to know where like problem areas will be before they occur, if that makes any sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And have you had any fish that are kind of like a surprise that you're like, oh, there's something about their anatomy that I wasn't expecting?
Yeah, there's a deep sea fish called a taper-tailed ribbonfish, I think it was called, but it's a cousin of the oarfish. And when we were printing it, we noticed that there was this consistent, equally spaced extra moisture towards the ridgeline of its top, towards underneath its dorsal fin. And I don't know exactly what it is because it's not visible to, at least to my eye, but it seemed like there were some sort of pores there or something. And that was a bit of a surprise. That was actually really difficult to get through. But, things you don't notice until you actually put ink on it and put paper to it, then you start noticing other things about the fish's anatomy.
Mm. So I see another pair of hands. Is that your wife's hands?
So that's my wife, Hazel. We print in tandem together. Once we actually start the process of printing on paper, you'll see her hands a lot more active. She'll be holding the paper down in certain areas where we don't want the paper to lift up prematurely. She'll be holding the paper off the fish where I don't want the paper to touch it prematurely.
And it also looks like that doesn't look like a lot of ink that you've applied to this fish right now.
Well, not right now. Typically what we do is we'll do, so you'll see here, we're just rubbing on a very small sheet of paper. And these are usually scraps from other failed attempts. And what I'm doing right now is just doing a test to see and check the ink consistency. It's always good to have a dry run, just to run my fingers over the fish, the contours, and have my finger memory. I don't know what else to call it, but it helps. And also it's really beneficial in trying to find problem areas before we actually apply the actual paper and go for a real attempt.
Does it also let you sort of dial in the amount of ink you have to distribute across the fish as well?
It does. We'll do several of these tests. On this day, we only did one, but a lot of times we'll do 2, 3, up to half a dozen attempts to figure out how much ink we need to pull off. If we need to adjust the ink, as in mixing it so that it's thicker, in case we want gradations. But all these tests, as quick as they are and as simple as they appear, they're really, really helpful. And it saves us a whole lot of heartache and stress when we're actually doing the real one.
Oh, that's great. How many prints are you able to usually pull off a finished fish?
We can do up to a dozen, but normally we don't, since it seems redundant by that point. We'll just go until we get at least 2 really good ones that we think that we just hit a quality or a standard that we feel good about putting our names onto. and everything else under that standard just turns into scrap.
Now, it looks like you've chosen strategic places to apply the ink.
So if you're at all familiar with applying makeup, it's actually very similar, the concept. You apply more makeup where you want it thicker, less where you want it less. You'll see here towards the belly, I didn't apply any at all, because what I was planning on doing is blending, taking ink where it's heavy and blending it downward so in order to create a very natural looking gradation.
Now, this dabbing that you're doing, is there a method to this? Besides an intimate understanding of sumi, how do you know if the ink distribution is to your liking?
If you press hard, you'll absorb more sumi ink into your dabber. If you press lightly, you'll soak up less. And so you'll see that I'm working fairly quickly, but each dab is controlled to what I think it's going to look like transferred onto the paper.
So you've got a mental image in place as you're distributing the ink across the fish.
Exactly. So it doesn't really show when I'm working on the fish, since like the black areas look black no matter how much I dab it. But constantly making a mental note as far as where I'm pressing, absorbing more ink than less. Yeah, because when we transfer onto the paper, it all shows. But right now, at this stage, nothing shows really.
Sorry, I just saw you dry off the eye there. Don't you need ink on the eye to print it?
The more the ink on the eye, see, the eye is a flat membrane, basically. And so it just turns out black or a gray tone. So ideally, what I do is, or typically what I do is, I remove most of the ink, but even if I remove most of the ink, there's still some remaining that creates a little bit of a texture, enough for me to create a base to paint on, because I have to paint in the eye afterwards.
Okay. Sorry, I just noticed there you were using what looked like your fingernail.
Oh yeah. So a lot of times when people pull a print off of a fish, there's a lot of times that people will want a hard line, like a really clean line. Often printers will take a brush and they'll paint in a line afterwards. Personally, when I see stuff like that, I mean, an artist is an artist and they can do whatever they want, but it looks like a painted line. But if you, for example, use the corner of your fingernail and you run it across the edge, then you'll make a much more natural looking line, or that was created by running my fingernail on the fish rather than taking a brush and painting one in.
So it helps you make like a nice crisp distinction between.
Right. If I want a crisp outline, then that's what I'll do.
Now, I also am noticing that when you're working on the dorsal ridge here, and then also when you were working on the belly, you're not printing the entire belly down to the bottom of it or up to the top of the fish. Is there a reason for that?
I actually do later on. I just don't do it right at this point, because there's other areas that are much more high in priority for me to do first, just to keep the proportions correct, just so that the paper isn't creasing. So that I get a whole image rather than a broken image.
Okay, so you're basically looking for proportionality when you're doing stuff like this.
Yeah.
So if you were to print from like the very top of the dorsal ridge to the very bottom of the belly, you would get a fish that looks like it got exploded onto the paper, essentially.
Well, it really all depends on the fish. I don't think I've ever started from the dorsal area first, so I can't really say. I usually start around the cheek area, and I go around. I'll go around its back, hit certain key points, and then I'll fill in the rest that are easy to get. So it's all sort of prioritized like that. I know a lot of printers start from the tail, and that works as well.
Oh, this is the moment of truth.
Yeah, here we go. So you'll see me here, like I won't lift it straight off immediately. I'll lift it slowly to check areas, make sure that the ink has been transferred in areas that I want.
That's beautiful. And then the eye, I can see that sort of like little bit of a membrane that you were talking about there, but you will paint in the eye afterward, correct?
Right. That's all hand painted.
And is that the only time that your brush will actually touch the paper?
No, not necessarily. That's the heaviest place where I'll go back in and touch something up. My wife and I, we have this self-imposed rule where we'll lift the paper off the fish and we'll take a look at it. And if I think that it's going to take more than 30 minutes to finish up that fish, including painting in the eye, then it's a whole lot better to just scrap it and try again, because we're going to end up getting a better print. And that's something that it might seem harsh to some, but it's been a really good exercise for us. I think the results show. I think it disciplines us to really work on getting a very effective print before putting a brush to it. The more, I mean, this is just a personal opinion, but I tend to think the more I touch something up with a brush afterwards, it starts to look like a painting rather than a print. And it loses it loses that charm of being, this is the print of a fish, or this is actually like the fish on paper. It becomes a painting instead.
And then it doesn't really become a reanimation of that fish, so to speak.
Right. It's like taking a fossil and saying, oh, I'm going to add some more clay to this to embellish it or accentuate it. And then you start losing that fossil, that charm of an artifact, and it becomes something else. And that's something I want to avoid.
Oh, that's a really beautiful prospect. I really like that philosophy as approaching it. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to talk with me and presenting your process to everybody at Catalina. We're really excited to be showing your process in video, and we're really happy that we've had a chance to work with you.
And I know we're going to be able to ask questions of you at the end of the program, so I want to thank you for sticking around for that. I also wanted to mention in your slideshow, your presentation, Michael, you showed the reconstruction of a lobster, and I wanted to let everyone know that Dwight Hwang has very generously donated that particular artwork to our forthcoming auction in support of our fundraiser, our benefit. So again, check our event website at betterunite.com/Catalina Museum if you would like an opportunity to bid on that beautiful piece of artwork and bring a piece of tradition into your home. So thank you for that. So also forthcoming, if we could pull up a slide just to put on everybody's calendar, our next program is going to be on the seaplanes of Avalon on November 14th. And we'll be able to bring in some vintage footage and some experts. And I know this is a topic that we get asked about all the time. And so we're really thrilled to be able to highlight this chapter of Catalina history. So mark your calendars for that as well. And great. Next up, we are going to share with you our local kids' attempt at making their own Gyotaku print. And I tried this with my children, and I can tell you it is very difficult, very, very complicated. But thanks to those donors who helped support our education fund, we were able to put together art kits with shells and other pieces from nature and supplies and get this project out to kids to see how they could try their hand at making their own Gyotaku. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results of those. Thanks. So like I said, it was not easy and super messy. And so when I see Dwight's messy hands, it makes me feel like we did something right there. So, so thank you. So we're going to open up for questions in just a second. If we do have a slide up, I'm hoping our next, perhaps not, but I'll just let everyone know. We are also this year participating again in an international project called The Big Draw. The Big Draw encourages people to come together and make a drawing, and the Catalina Island Museum will be participating in this project, which you can do at home. You can print out what you need at home and take a picture and send it to us. This year's topic is about climate change, and so our topic is kelping climate change, which goes along nicely with today's presentation too, and thinking about what a beautiful resource in our local kelp forest we have here around the island, and how important it is to keep it pristine for the future. So there's details there on the Big Draw, which you'll be able to find on our website or pick up supplies here. And we're asking each person to fill in and make a drawing of a Garibaldi or a part of a kelp, and we're going to create a kelp forest in the museum's lobby. So help us with this great community project, easy to share, easy to do together, and for a really good cause, a great message. So, all right, so with that, if there are questions from the audience participating today, I know I have some myself. We can open it up. So thanks everybody. Thank you for being here. And Michael, please stick around. Now, Dwight was supposed to be here today, but he is traveling. And so it doesn't look like we were able to get him to call in, but I know that you've worked with him for so long, Michael, and plus I have some questions just about the history of Gyotaku for you too. But let's open it up to everyone else first. So. If there's anyone out there who has a question, you can just take yourself off mute or unmute everybody, and we'll go ahead.
This is Carol. I have a quick question. Did they ever work with colored inks in this tradition, or is it always black sumi ink?
Thank you, Carol, for that really good question. So traditionally, in traditional form, they would only have worked with sumi ink, just black and white. Okay. But as we see the development of this art form, you start to see the incorporation of more colors by modern contemporary artists.
Yes, I wonder.
And sometimes a client will request that Dwight colorizes a print, and what he will usually do is he will go in post-production and he will add in the colors so he can have a little bit more control as to what's going on. But as for what he produces by his hand, he's working with primarily just black and white monochromatic.
I figured more traditional, but I wondered if that was shifting, which you've said already, you know, let's play with this a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What I really like about the monochromatic, it really shows the flexibility and the versatility of ink and how you can get different finishes out of it.
Oh, I love it. It's beautiful, the black and white. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, this is Cliff Haig. I had sent a number of questions in via chat, but I don't know that they're going through. How many prints can you get from a single fish?
So that's a really great question. Dwight, sometimes it depends on how eager he is to eat the fish. So he sometimes he'll take a fish, and if it's something that's it's really good fresh, then he will get maybe about 6 or 7 prints off of it, or as many as he's happy with, and then he will take it away. He'll rinse it off because sumi ink is made from basically just charcoal. He rinses it off, and he's able to turn it into something to eat. If it's a fish that isn't really edible, then he will steam it up and he will feed it to his dog, or he will turn it into fertilizer. So the fish never goes to waste. But he has had a carp that he has kept. He's taken out, thawed, printed, returned back to the freezer again, and he has done that for about 2 years.
Wow.
And so he has used the same fish, I would say, a couple dozen times. And so you can get a lot of he can get a lot of traction off of single fish if he wants to. But again, as I said, if he's very eager to eat it, then he will maybe go, okay, I've worked with it for half an hour and I'm hungry now. And he'll cook that up.
So I'm wondering with the lobster, because that involves such massive deconstruction, is that a one-off or can you get several from a lobster as well?
That is a good question. I'll have to clarify with Dwight later on, but I believe he can get multiple prints off of the lobster as well. Because the shell isn't something that's going to rot quickly. The exoskeleton, he can probably save those, and he can probably bring them out and reprint it, as long as he can remember the order that everything came apart. But because Dwight is so good at envisioning the completed process, then I do think that he has done a couple times, used the same segments. He recently did a monstrous lobster for somebody, I believe, from the New England area. Just an absolutely massive specimen. I think he was saying it was something like 21 pounds.
Wow.
And, or no, 12 pounds. 12 pounds. I got the two numbers mixed up. 12 pound. It was a 12-pound lobster. He printed it up, and he was requested to do it from the side, from the top, and from the bottom. And the top and the side, you can keep it intact, but when he did it from the bottom, he had to do the reconstruction process. And he said it was just absolutely amazing to be able to do that.
Wow.
I hope he got to eat that one.
You know, I never bothered to ask him, and I would be extremely jealous if he did.
I noticed his fingers were quite black.
Yeah.
Does that stuff come off easily, or are you stuck with black fingers for days?
Well, because Dwight works with it so often, it's actually been incorporated into kind of like some of the crevices in his fingers. But for the most part, you can just rub your fingers together and it dries off just like that. And then rinsing it off under water, it is pretty indelible. It is like you can just wash it off fairly easily. And what's really cool about the paper, and this is something I forgot to mention, is that because the fibers in the paper, when they dry up, they almost seal the ink into the fibers. So you can actually scratch your finger on the surface of a print, and it's not going to scratch off. Of course, if you're going to use something like a pair of scissors or something and try to scrape it on top, you're going to get something. But it's very hard. Rubbing your fingers over it roughly is still not going to get the ink out of the paper. But off the hands, very easy.
Now, doesn't he do some sort of surface treatment on the paper once the print is finished to protect it from moisture or dirt?
Nope. That's he has it framed. And there is something, I believe, a process that he's been recently working with called the urauchi. I believe it's urauchi, where it's almost like a wet mounting, and it flattens it out and gets rid of all the crevices. Because when you saw him manipulating the paper, you'll see that there's folds and creases that develop as he does that. I personally prefer that because you can see the hands of the artist at work as he was creating the print. But some other people, because they don't have the frames to be able to mount it, they ask for it to be perfectly flattened out. And the urauchi technique that he does adds a finish onto it, and it makes it perfectly flat.
Wow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
And as far as putting a finish on top of the print, as I was describing before, the inks almost get sealed into the fibers. So nothing to really worry about it getting wiped away or scratched off.
Well, in some humid environments, you've got moisture, and that can cause mold and the like, especially, probably there's a little bit of fish juice in the paper. So is there a process that you can spray it with a polyacrylate or something else over the surface just to protect it from mold, dirt, moisture, and other environmental assaults?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I'm not a trained conservator, so I wouldn't be able to answer that specifically with specific products you could use, but it sounds like you could do something like that. I should probably just show you. I've got a print myself on my wall, and there's been no sort of issues with smell or rot or anything like that. It's been absolutely a beautiful thing to have hanging on my wall. But if you are concerned about cleanliness or sealing it up or keeping it safe, then I think there are products that you could find that will seal it up for that.
So through all this process, have you learned how to do this yourself? Did you get any instruction from Dwight?
I've had a chance to sit down with Dwight a couple times, and he's tried to show me the ropes. I do have pictures of the first things that I created, and they are absolutely hideous. I would not want to show those off. It's exactly as Julie was describing, it's incredibly hard. The pressure that you use with your fingers, you need to have just the perfect control over it. I've heard stories of Gyotaku artists who have put too much pressure on and they burst the guts out the back of the fish because they were trying too hard to get that ink to transfer.
What inspired Dwight to begin or take up this practice? What inspired him to try to learn this traditional work?
That's a great question. Thank you. He spent a lot of time in Japan in his past. And as you know, Japan has got it's an archipelago. It's surrounded by waters all around him. And so they've got a very dominant, very prominent fishing industry. And angling is a pretty large pastime over there. And Dwight, he walked into an angling shop, I believe it was in Tokyo. And on the wall in this angling shop, there was a Gyotaku print. And he thought, oh, that is such a cool aesthetic. I wish that I could have that. And he decided that he was going to teach himself how to do Gyotaku based on what he had encountered in the angling shop there. And he essentially just read up on it. He watched YouTube videos and he just honed his practice over time. And what I described with my first print, that it was absolutely terrible, I'm sure Dwight felt the very same way about the first prints that he ever created. But practice makes perfect. And as he honed his hands, the pressure, the inks that he worked with, as he practiced his skills, he was able to rise to become the master that we see that he is today.
So another question, some of the images in the gallery are compound images. They'll have multiple specimens, they'll have kelp, they'll have other things included. I assume that, you know, if you, let's say you've done 3 or 4 images already on one sheet, and then you screw up the next one, that sheet gets tossed and you start over again. And I'm wondering what the kind of the goof up rate is on some of those big pieces. I've got to imagine it happens a lot.
More times than an artist would like to admit, I'm sure. You know, I think a lot of artists, they want to emphasize that thing that, you know, it's just something that wells out of them and they're able to create the art. But I think Dwight is not shy at all about all the mistakes that he's made. If you see the stack of completed, marketable, saleable prints that he's got, that is much smaller than, you know, than the stack of scraps that he creates. And he's told me before that, you know, sometimes we'll print a fish 12 times and I'm only happy with 2 of them. And the rest, they just become scrap paper. And yeah, I think it's exactly as described. It's an extremely intense, extremely involved process where even one screw up, one slip up is going to restart the entire thing. And yeah, as I described before, you can't scratch or you can't erase the ink off the paper. Once it's in there, it's in there.
So does he make his livelihood doing these prints now, or that's his day job?
Yeah, for a while he was involved with animation studios, working with storyboarding and everything like that. But he was able to go full-time producing Gyotaku. His wife is a framer and she creates the frames for his art. And they are able to do everything from the studio in their house. And he's absolutely able to make a living. And he's fulfilled some pretty impressive commissions off of this.
So it's a 2-person show, basically, the whole thing.
Yep. Yeah.
And how do they go about getting commissions?
Commissions, you can email them. An email will pop up on the screen at the end of this presentation, and you can email him about commissions.
No, I mean, how does he generally market this? How does he make himself?
Word of mouth. Word of mouth, or Instagram, or you know, an exhibition that he has, for example, at Catalina or at Japan Foundation. People will see his art and they will contact him. They will be able to find his contact information on business cards or on the presentation that we're watching now. We make sure to get his email out into places where people will be able to send them out and order commissions.
So we're going to put that up in a second here. I wanted to share with this group too. Unfortunately, this show has been seen by not nearly as many people as we had hoped because of the museum's continued closure. But I'm really pleased to share with you that while we will be taking this exhibition down as scheduled on the 2nd of November, we are also going to reinstall it in a year from now so that people have a chance to come in and experience it again. And maybe we can get Dwight here and maybe we can all try our hands with at least some seaweed. It would be a lot of fun to do that together. So Michael, thank you so much for all of your time and for partnering with us and helping us to bring this amazing artwork to Catalina and to life. And to all of our members, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody soon, all right? Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.